Welcome back to the War Desk, your most critical updates on the evolving conflict between the US-Israel alliance and Iran. Day 31, and what a day it is. When Washington and Tel Aviv recklessly reached out and touched Iran's nuclear red line, they didn't just ignite a war, they personally signed the death warrant for their own era of Middle Eastern dominance. The United States and Israel have just executed the most reckless gamble in modern military history, deploying F-35 strike packages armed with bunker-busting GBU-57 penetrators directly against Iran's uranium enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordo. But they miscalculated, catastrophically, irreversibly. The underground explosions that followed were not Washington's victory anthem, they were Tehran's starting pistol. The beast had been poked. And the beast does not warn twice. What followed was not a defensive crouch inside hardened bunkers. It was the activation of a retaliatory war machine, decades in the making, precise, merciless, and operating at a scale that left Pentagon supercomputers flooding their screens with red alerts. U.S. carrier groups are burning. American air bases from Iraq to Jordan are shaking under ballistic missile rain. Iron Dome has been pushed past its breaking point. And in Washington, Donald Trump is facing the most severe political earthquake of his presidency, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff preparing what many are now calling an unprecedented internal reckoning. How did the axis of four Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas manage to bring a supposedly invincible Israel to its knees in such a compressed timeline? How did Tehran's retaliatory doctrine shatter the myth of American naval supremacy in a single operational sequence? And can Donald Trump survive the political firestorm now consuming him from within his own military establishment? Every brutal development, every game-changing strike, every consequence that is reshaping the global order, all of it, dissected without mercy, right after this. Before we dive in, if you haven't already, hit like and subscribe so you never miss a critical update from the front lines of history. Strategic catastrophe. Washington and Tel Aviv sign their own death warrant. Military history has just recorded one of its most reckless and self-destructive chapters. A wolf pack of F-35s, armed with the most powerful conventional bunker busters ever deployed, tore through the night sky and bore down on Iran's most sacred nuclear infrastructure. Washington convinced itself it was performing a precise surgical operation cutting out a dangerous tumor before it could metastasize. What it actually did was plunge a knife directly into a nest of fire ants that had been waiting, coiled, for exactly this moment. This was not surgery. This was provocation at the highest possible threshold, an act so reckless it detonated a retaliatory sequence that even its architects cannot now contain or reverse. Tel Aviv and Washington, intoxicated by decades of unchallenged military dominance and the cold comfort of spreadsheet superiority, genuinely believed that hardened underground facilities carved hundreds of meters into solid mountain rock could be neutralized through brute technological force alone. They were wrong in the most consequential way imaginable, because what they were not striking was mere reinforced concrete. They were striking the will of a civilization that has spent 40 years preparing for precisely this moment. The muffled detonations beneath Iranian soil were not the sound of Western triumph. They were the funeral bell for American presence in the Middle East struck by the hand of the very power that chose to provoke it. The moment the first bunker buster detonated, Tehran's response architecture, built across decades of patient preparation and refined under the pressure of maximum isolation, began executing. Not with warnings, not with diplomatic cables, with live fire. Thousands of launch bay doors swung open simultaneously across Iran's underground missile cities buried deep in mountain ranges. Long-range ballistic missiles and swarms of kamikaze UAVs streamed skyward like a storm front that had been building for a generation. This was not a proportional counterstrike. This was the full activation of a pre-planned annihilation sequence calculated to the millimeter, designed to overwhelm every defensive layer the enemy had ever constructed. As the skies above the Persian Gulf split open with thousands of fire trails, the execution of the death sentence against American military presence in the Middle East had officially begun. Washington lit the fuse, Tehran chose how it burned, and the Pentagon's most sophisticated early warning infrastructure was already drowning in threat data it had no answer for. Supercomputers drenched in red alerts. Thousands of inbound objects screaming toward carrier strike groups and forward operating bases. America had made the single greatest strategic miscalculation of its modern military history. It had assumed Iran would absorb the blow and retreat. Instead, Iran absorbed nothing. It detonated everything. Steel fist strikes the fleet. America's floating fortresses become cold steel coffins. If Washington considered its carrier strike groups the ultimate symbol of unchallengeable power, the iron fist capable of crushing any resistance anywhere on Earth, then Tehran just drove that fist directly into a shredder. The age of the slow, expensive, and catastrophically vulnerable floating giant is over. It ended not in a theoretical war game, but in the burning waters of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The moment American and Israeli ordnance crossed Iran's nuclear red line, Tehran activated its maritime annihilation doctrine without a single second of hesitation. No more diplomatic theater. No more proportional gestures. What followed was a systematic, coordinated execution targeting the throat and the pride of the United States Navy simultaneously. Carrier strike groups, surrounded by the most advanced escort destroyers ever put to sea, suddenly appeared on Iranian radar screens as nothing more than enormous, slow-moving target coordinates waiting to be serviced. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, floating fortresses worth tens of billions of dollars each, wrapped in destroyer screens loaded with Aegis combat systems that the Pentagon had always considered the gold standard of naval defense architecture. The fatal error was overconfidence, the institutionalized assumption that layered American defense systems were categorically undefeatable. But the IRGC's saturation swarm doctrine does not negotiate with algorithms. When hundreds of hypersonic Fattah-2 ballistic anti-ship missiles simultaneously converged from multiple vectors alongside coordinated Shahed kamikaze drone swarms, every targeting algorithm inside Aegis and Patriot entered a state of catastrophic cognitive overload. Each defensive layer, each billion-dollar pride point, was peeled away with systematic efficiency. Then came the defining moment that military historians will mark in bold. Iranian hypersonic anti-ship missiles tore through the darkness, penetrated the specialized armor plating of carrier hulls, and detonated inside aircraft storage bays and fuel depots. Columns of fire, hundreds of meters tall, erupted over the water. The sound that rolled across the ocean was not just the report of high explosives. It was the sound of an entire era of American naval doctrine collapsing in real time. F-35s that never got airborne, radar arrays that never achieved lock, all of it consumed in a firestorm no defensive system could intercept or slow. For the first time since Midway, American aircraft carriers, the supreme symbols of post-war global power projection, were sent to the ocean floor by the military of a country Washington had spent decades dismissing as a manageable threat. This was not material loss, measured in dollars evaporating. This was the complete and total bankruptcy of the forward power projection doctrine. Washington had lost its long arm. It had lost its strategic deterrence at sea. And most critically, it had lost the one thing no defense budget can replace: the credibility of the threat itself. Tehran had just demonstrated, with kinetic finality, that the most expensive collection of military hardware ever assembled cannot compensate for strategic arrogance and tactical poverty. Iran's air defense crushes the stealth myth. The West's greatest illusion dies over Persian skies. When Washington and Tel Aviv deployed their crown jewels F-35 Lightning TIEs and F-22 Raptors, they did so with the supreme confidence of predators who believe the hunting ground belongs exclusively to them. Pentagon hawks had sedated themselves on the comfortable fantasy that stealth technology worth hundreds of billions of dollars had rendered their strike packages effectively invisible, free to deliver destruction upon Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and simply disappear back into the night. Without consequence. Reality arrived like a steel hammer, directly between the eyes of the fifth-generation air power doctrine. Over Iranian airspace, there are no uninvited guests. The moment the first stealth fighters touched the edge of Iranian-controlled airspace, Tehran's multi-layered air defense network activated a digital kill grid of a lethality and sophistication that Western air power theorists had systematically refused to account for. Iran had not simply integrated Russian S-300 and S-400 systems into its defensive architecture. It had spent years quietly developing indigenous long-range air defense platforms alongside domestically engineered, active electronically scanned array radar systems, with the specific capability of stripping away the radar-absorbent coating layers that Lockheed Martin's engineers had spent decades perfecting. In Tehran's operational framework, stealth is not invisibility. Stealth is a thin disguise, and Iran had built the eyes to see through it. The result was not an air battle. It was an aerial execution conducted at a pace that left Israeli and American pilots with no meaningful decision cycle. F-35s, The obsessive pride of the Israeli Air Force were target-locked by Iranian long-range surface-to-air missile systems before their pilots could even sequence their cruise missile firing protocols. The sky above Iran erupted in orange fireballs. But those were not the flames of Iranian infrastructure absorbing American bombs. Those were billion-dollar stealth aircraft, disintegrating and carving smoking craters into desert floors and the slopes of the Zagros mountain range. The electronic warfare dimension was equally catastrophic for the alliance. Every advanced jamming and suppression system the Americans brought to bear was neutralized, reversed, and exploited by Iranian counter-electronic warfare technology. Seasoned Israeli pilots, men who had spent careers bullying technologically inferior opponents, found themselves cockpit blind, communications severed, and hurtling into a digital kill zone that had been pre-configured around their own operational signatures. The IRGC then executed the move that completed the psychological destruction of American air power credibility in the region. Iranian electronic warfare units reached out and seized control of the United States' most advanced reconnaissance, UAVs, Global Hawks, and MQ-9 Reapers mid-flight, turning the enemy's own surveillance assets into blind, silent liabilities. American command centers in Qatar and Bahrain lost their battlefield picture entirely. They watched the architecture of their operational plan collapse in real time, with no ability to reverse the cascade. Each aircraft killed over Iranian soil was not merely a financial hemorrhage for the Pentagon procurement budget. It was a bayonet driven through the central assumption of Western military dominance, the belief that technological spending translates automatically into battlefield supremacy. Iranian airspace is no longer contested territory. It has become a graveyard for the ambitions of those who believed money could substitute for strategic intelligence and national will. The Axis of Four. The death grip Titan's empire drowns in a nightmare of its own making. While Washington and Tel Aviv were still processing the scale of their carrier losses and the wreckage of their stealth aviation doctrine, a second realization struck with equal force. This war had never been confined to Iranian borders. An integrated multi-domain military coalition, the Axis of Four, had simultaneously activated its total war posture, and the combined effect was a vice grip closing from every cardinal direction at once. Iran was no longer a single nation absorbing punishment. Tehran had become the supreme command, brain-cold, methodical, and operating through three battle-hardened extensions: Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis from the south, and Hamas at the interior. Together, they formed not a loose ideological alliance, but a fully integrated war machine, where one actor's firepower serves as the launch platform for the next actor's advance, creating an attack matrix so dense and multi-vectored that no Aegis system, no Patriot battery, and no Iron Dome configuration in existence could decode and defeat it simultaneously. From the north, Hezbollah, Iran's most capable external military instrument, transformed Israel's northern border zone into a living hell. No longer sporadic exchanges. Hezbollah unleashed precision-guided rocket and missile barrages against command centers, ammunition depots, and strategic population centers simultaneously. Israeli radar networks choked on the volume. Elite armored formations were frozen in place, under relentless MLRS fire from fighters who knew every contour of the terrain they were defending. Hezbollah struck with the measured confidence of an army that had been preparing this specific operational scenario for over a decade. From the south, the Houthis, once dismissed by Western analysts as a ragtag insurgency, proved definitively that they are the nightmare scenario for every Western naval planner who ever drew up a Red Sea contingency. Equipped with Iranian-supplied targeting intelligence and guided by Tehran's satellite and electronic warfare infrastructure, Houthi forces locked down the Red Sea lanes and the Bab el-Mandeb choke point with long-range anti-ship cruise missiles. American and Israeli resupply vessels were hunted without pause. Washington's confident narrative about guaranteeing the free flow of global commerce was dismantled in real time. The Houthis were not just sinking ships, they were strangling the economic lifeline of the entire alliance, while bleeding American operational budgets at a rate no defense appropriation could sustain. At the interior, Hamas and allied resistance factions within Gaza struck deep into the seams of Israel's internal security apparatus. With IDF formations stretched thin across the Iranian and Hezbollah fronts, Hamas exploited the resulting gaps with surgical precision, striking at strategic infrastructure nodes and command layer targets, injecting chaos and fear directly into Tel Aviv's decision-making hierarchy at the exact moment it could least afford cognitive disruption. Tehran's role in this architecture was that of a tiger with wings, simultaneously projecting raw power and the kind of flexible, responsive operational intelligence that transformed its partners from independent actors into synchronized instruments of a single unified campaign. Iran did not need to march conventional armies across international borders to dominate this battlefield. It needed only to activate what it had already built, and the entire region erupted on command. Washington had spent years attempting to isolate Iran. What these events confirmed is that it was America and Israel who had become isolated, caged inside a ring of fire whose dimensions, density, and sustain rate they had never come close to accurately modeling. Israel collapses, the final reckoning for a nation built on borrowed power. What is unfolding across Tel Aviv, Haifa, and the entire Israeli strategic depth right now is not a border conflict or a limited exchange. It is the comprehensive, humiliating, and accelerating collapse of a military entity that spent decades marketing itself as categorically undefeatable. When Washington detonated Iran's nuclear red line, it didn't just expose its own strategic bankruptcy, it pushed its closest regional partner directly into a furnace with no exits and no fire suppression. Iron Dome, the technological crown jewel that Western defense marketing transformed into a symbol of Israeli exceptionalism, has been rendered operationally irrelevant. The saturation mathematics of Iran's coordinated barrage doctrine, combined with simultaneous Hezbollah rocket barrages from the north, overwhelmed the system's intercept capacity in the opening operational phase, and has kept it beyond recovery ever since. Warheads are no longer being knocked down over Israeli cities. They are arriving. Command centers, energy infrastructure, strategic port facilities. The missile salvos, finding their marks, are not distributed randomly across civilian areas. They are systematically dismantling the operational and economic sinews of Israeli national power. The port facilities at Ashdod and Haifa, the arterial lifeblood of Israeli import and export capacity, have been struck and functionally degraded by precision fires from Hezbollah in the north and Houthi maritime strike packages from the south simultaneously. No resupply flowing. No carrier strike group offshore to backstop Israeli air operations. No functioning intercept layer overhead. Israel is being suffocated inside the very cage of pressure it once used to contain others. The IDF, celebrated in Western media for decades as perhaps the world's most professional and capable fighting force, is now visibly disintegrating across multiple simultaneous fronts. Merkava tanks, the pride of Israeli armored doctrine, burn on roadsides, abandoned or destroyed before they could be brought to bear against the threat axis they were designed to neutralize. The economic dimension of the collapse is moving as fast as the military one. Every commercial activity has ceased. Every international supply chain touching Israeli ports has been disrupted. The national treasury is hemorrhaging at a rate that peacetime GDP cannot hope to offset. And the one guarantor that was supposed to prevent precisely this scenario, American naval power positioned offshore, is no longer a factor in any operational calculation. Israel is now confronting the terminal consequence of building national security entirely on the assumption of indefinite external patronage. When that patronage folds under the weight of its own catastrophic losses, what remains is a nation that never completed the task of developing genuine strategic self-sufficiency. The bunkers of the Israeli military command structure are filling with the stunned and the directionless officers trained to dominate, now huddled underground, processing a reality their entire professional doctrine told them could not exist. History has never recorded Israel in circumstances this dire. A regional power entity, now a diminishing collection of burning ruins, diplomatically isolated, militarily overwhelmed, and strategically abandoned, at the precise moment it needed the architecture of Western partnership to perform exactly as advertised. The firestorm will not stop, and every square kilometer of devastation is the direct and measurable consequence of choosing arrogance over honest strategic assessment. Washington in freefall. Donald Trump faces his reckoning from inside the Pentagon. While the Middle East convulses under the weight of Tehran's retaliatory doctrine, the other epicenter of this earthquake is located not in any combat zone, but inside the corridors of American institutional power itself. The White House is no longer a global command hub. It has become a besieged compound, wrapped in a suffocating atmosphere of fear, recrimination, and cascading institutional breakdown. Donald Trump, who built his political brand on aggressive confidence and the projection of unilateral American dominance, is staring directly at a reality his entire political psychology was designed to avoid. The carrier groups are gone. The stealth aviation doctrine is exposed as a fantasy. The forward-basing network across the Gulf is trembling, and the satellite feed from every theater of active operations is delivering a continuous stream of imagery that no communications team can spin into anything approaching acceptable. The most dangerous pressure Trump now faces is not from Iran's missiles, but from the institution he commands. The Joint Chiefs combat-tested officers who understand with unambiguous clarity that the strike on Iran's nuclear facilities was not a strategic masterstroke but a catastrophic act of institutional self-destruction, have reached the end of their operational patience. A wave of institutional fury is building inside the Pentagon's most senior command layers. These are not political opponents manufacturing opposition for electoral advantage. These are military professionals who watched the world's most expensive armed forces suffer devastating and avoidable losses because of decisions driven by political theater rather than strategic calculation. The documentation of accountability is being assembled. The charge is precise: engineering a military catastrophe with no viable exit strategy, at the cost of American lives, American hardware, and American strategic credibility across every theater simultaneously. That charge, building in classified chambers across the Potomac, hangs over Trump's political survival like a blade that grows heavier with each new battlefield report. The contrast with Tehran could not be more complete. While Iranian command structures operate with the composed precision of an institution that has been rehearsing this moment for 30 years, Washington's crisis management apparatus is convulsing, populated by advisors who cheered the strikes loudest and are now the most visibly paralyzed by their consequences. The fear of impeachment, of historical condemnation, of being recorded as the administration that broke American superpower credibility, is consuming the West Wing in real time. American citizens are beginning to respond not with flag-waving support for military intervention, but with street-level demands for accountability from an administration that sent their sons and daughters into a strategic trap with no extraction plan. The domestic political weather is turning with a speed that mirrors the operational collapse abroad. Washington is not shaking from Iranian ordnance. Washington is shaking from the internal collapse of its own self-belief, and that particular wound no defense appropriation bill can close. The Lion's Anthem: Iran rewrites the rules of global power with fire and will. When the smoke from America's sunken carrier groups finally disperses, and the silence permanently settles over the wreckage of stealth aircraft scattered across Iranian mountain ranges, what will remain is not a battlefield. It is a new global order, written in fire, bearing Tehran's signature, and impossible to reverse. Iran did not arrive at this position through negotiating table promises or international forum speeches. It forged this position across decades of strategic patience, domestic scientific determination, and the absolute refusal to allow external pressure, however crushing, to redirect its national trajectory. Look at how Tehran manages the post-kinetic phase of this conflict. While Washington processes its political trauma and the impeachment machinery grinds toward Trump's future, Iran has already begun establishing the security architecture of what comes next, calmly, methodically, without the need for triumphalist theater. The rubble of Tel Aviv and the haunted silence across American forward operating bases in Iraq, Jordan, and Qatar communicate Tehran's position more eloquently than any press statement. The victor sets the terms, and Iran is now setting them across every strategic maritime lane, from the Strait of Hormuz to the southern Red Sea, establishing facts on water that no future diplomatic negotiation will easily unwind. The axis of four, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and Iran at the apex, has proven that it is not an ideological convenience, but a genuine integrated warfighting system, capable of simultaneous precision operations across multiple geographic domains. The degradation of Israel across every dimension, military, economic, psychological, and infrastructural, was not achieved through a single overwhelming blow, but through the relentless application of coordinated, sustained, multi-vector pressure that exhausted every Israeli defensive system and resource simultaneously. What the world is witnessing is the complete exposure of what happens when a military doctrine built on financial superiority and technological mythology meets a military doctrine built on operational creativity, strategic depth, and the kind of national resolve that no sanctioned regime has ever successfully extinguished. Iran did not need more aircraft carriers. It needed better ideas, longer patience, and the will to execute when the moment arrived. The nations of the broader Middle East, those that spent years calculating their security wagers based on American reliability and Israeli invincibility, are now recalibrating every assumption simultaneously. The architecture of the Abraham Accords, the Gulf security partnerships, the forward-basing agreements, all of it is being re-evaluated through the lens of what just happened in real time, with real hardware, and real consequences that no amount of diplomatic management can paper over. Washington can no longer credibly invoke the rules-based international order it spent 40 years constructing, not when its own actions shattered those rules, and the military instrument it used to enforce them now lies in pieces on the ocean floor. Trump, the political avatar of American unilateral confidence, is already receding toward irrelevance. The empire that lent him his stage is entering its twilight, lurching through the consequences of its own arrogance, having collided with a wall of steel that bore a name it had spent decades underestimating. This is not Iran's triumph alone. It is the declaration written in the language that power structures actually understand that the 21st century will not be organized around a single dominant center. It will be organized around the demonstrated capacity to defend sovereign space against those who believe their budget size exempts them from consequence. Never provoke a nation that has spent decades preparing for the day you finally did. Never discount the will of a people who decided long ago that the ocean floor was a more acceptable outcome than submission. The reckoning has been delivered. The ledger has been settled. And when the fires finally cool, what the world will see in their place is a Middle East shaped by those who had the discipline to earn it, not those who assumed they were entitled to it. What do you think about how this confrontation is reshaping the global power landscape? Is Iran's rise marking a genuine historical turning point, or is this simply the opening movement of an even more volatile sequence yet to come? Drop your analysis in the comments, and let's decode what happens next together. If the intelligence and perspective in today's briefing gave you something real to work with, share it, like it, and subscribe to the War Desk to stay locked in as history continues to accelerate. Your support is what keeps the analysis sharp and the coverage uncompromising. Stay aware. Stay ahead. We'll see you in the next briefing.